The seeds of rebellion. A distant king and a new world. It's 1763, and everything has just shifted dramatically. In the lush forests of Pennsylvania, the last echoes of musket fire from the French and Indian War are fading away. For 7 grueling years, American settlers have fought side by side with British soldiers against French forces and their Native American allies. As the smoke clears from battlefields stretching all the way from the Ohio Valley to Quebec, the Crown stands victorious. The Union Jack flies high from Hudson Bay to the Florida Keys. But this victory comes at a steep price, one that's about to shake the empire to its very core. In London, Chancellor of the Exchequer George Grenville stares down at ledgers filled with staggering numbers. The war has cost the empire nearly £70 million, a sum so huge it's hard to wrap your head around. The national debt has doubled, and interest payments alone gobble up half the government's annual revenue. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, 10,000 imperial soldiers are still stationed in North America, costing another £300,000 each year. Someone's got to foot the bill for this empire, and Grenville's gaze shifts westward, across 3,000 miles of ocean, to the very provinces that London just fought so hard to defend. On the other side of the ocean, Americans are celebrating their survival and dreaming big about expansion. Virginia planters are buzzing with excitement over the rich Ohio Valley lands that are now ripe for settlement. Pennsylvania farmers are picturing their sons carving out homesteads from the western forests. Massachusetts merchants are calculating profits from fresh trading opportunities. They've shed blood alongside imperial regulars, putting their futures on the line for the war effort. So naturally, they believe the spoils of victory should belong to them just as much as to any lord lounging in London. Then, out of nowhere, comes the proclamation of 1763, a decision that cuts deep into American dreams. King George III declares that no settlement is allowed west of the Appalachian Mountains. The very lands that colonists fought to win are now off limits, reserved for Native American tribes who had mostly fought against the Crown. Veterans expecting land grants find their service unrewarded, and speculators who bought up Western claims see their investments go up in smoke. In Williamsburg, a young lawyer named Patrick Henry reads the proclamation and feels a growing anger bubbling inside him. Meanwhile, in Boston, Samuel Adams, a whiz at political organization, sees a golden opportunity in this provincial frustration. He knows that a grievance, when properly nurtured, can blossom into defiance. The proclamation of 1763 is just the first drop in a brewing storm. Grenville's financial troubles call for immediate action, and if settlers are benefiting from imperial protection, London's logic suggests they should help pay for it. Enter the Sugar Act of 1764, which slaps a modest duty on molasses, sugar, and other luxury imports. But here's the kicker. In the counting houses of Boston and New York, merchants quickly realize that these modest levies, when strictly enforced, can wipe out profit margins built over generations of calculated risk. For years, provincial merchants have operated comfortably in the gray areas of Crown law, relying on flexible interpretations of trade regulations by underpaid customs officials. Smuggling wasn't seen as a crime. It was just business as usual. But the Sugar Act flips the script. As Royal Naval patrols multiply and customs enforcement becomes a serious, no-nonsense affair, merchants who built their fortunes on creative interpretations of trade law suddenly find themselves labeled as criminals. Then comes the Stamp Act of 1765, which turns merchant grumbles into full-blown rebellion. Unlike the Sugar Act, which mainly affects the commercial classes, The Stamp Act reaches into every American life. Every newspaper, legal document, playing card, and marriage license now requires an official stamp bought with imperial currency. For the first time, London's taxes reach directly into the pockets of everyday folks, demanding tribute just for living as subjects of the crown. This constitutional mess horrifies American lawyers, who have been trained in the English legal tradition that dates back to the Magna Carta of 1215. No taxation without representation. Yet, the colonists don't elect anyone to the House of Commons and send no delegates to the Lords. So, how can Westminster claim the right to tax them? London's answer is the theory of virtual representation. Every member of Parliament, imperial politicians argue, speaks not just for their local constituency, but for the entire empire. Benjamin Franklin, acting as an American agent in London, listens to this with barely contained disdain. The Stamp Act also brings another headache for settlers, the Quartering Act, to save some cash for the royal treasury. Parliament decides that colonial governments have to provide housing, food, and supplies for the imperial soldiers stationed in North America. This requirement hits hard because it goes against a fundamental English right. There's nothing worse than forcing free people to take in soldiers during peacetime. Just so you know, the Third Amendment to the future U.S. Constitution will ban this practice. But in 1765, colonists don't have any constitutional protection against what Westminster demands, and suddenly every red-coated soldier becomes a symbol of colonial oppression. As you can imagine, pushback starts quietly, but soon bursts into the open. In Boston, Samuel Adams steps up and organizes the Sons of Liberty, a name inspired by a speech from Irish MP Isaac Barr. These guys meet in secret, but make their moves in public, coordinating protests that look spontaneous, but are actually well planned. Their network spreads quickly through colonial ports, with Isaac Sears and Alexander McDougall in New York, Charles Thompson in Philadelphia, and Christopher Gadsden in Charleston. Gadsden's yellow flag, featuring a coiled rattlesnake and the words "Don't tread on me," becomes a lasting symbol of American resistance. The Sons of Liberty are masters of political theater, hanging effigies of stamp distributors from Liberty trees and threatening customs officials with tar and feathers. The word spreads fast. Working with the authorities comes with risks that far outweigh any financial gain. But dissent isn't just about protests and intimidation. It needs legal backing and clear arguments. Provincial assemblies turn into hubs for constitutional debate. In Virginia's House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry fires up the crowd with resolutions challenging Westminster's authority, famously declaring, "If this be treason, make the most of it." The Massachusetts General Court jumps on board, adopting similar resolutions and calling for a Stamp Act Congress to unite their response. 9 provinces send delegates to New York in October 1765, forming the first inter-American political body since the Albany Congress of 1754. The Stamp Act Congress crafts documents that carefully outline the difference between Parliament's right to regulate trade and its claim to tax colonial property. They agree that while external duties on imports might be okay, internal taxes on American property are a direct violation of their rights. Another vital network starts to form, the Committees of Correspondence. Samuel Adams comes up with this idea in Boston, and it spreads like wildfire, connecting revolutionary spirits throughout the colonies. Each town and county sets up a committee to keep in touch with nearby communities and other colonies. When British authorities take action in one area, news travels fast, allowing for coordinated responses before officials can take advantage of colonial isolation. These committees turn 13 separate colonial societies into something like a unified political community. For the first time, colonists start to see their local issues as part of a bigger picture of British oppression. As 1765 comes to a close, colonial resistance scores its first big win. The Stamp Act becomes unenforceable across British North America. No one is selling colonial stamps because nobody dares to. In London, British merchants who rely on colonial trade start pushing Parliament for a repeal, as colonial boycotts of British goods cost them thousands of pounds in lost sales. By March 1766, Parliament finally repeals the Stamp Act, sparking massive celebrations among the colonists. But hold on, the celebration is short-lived. On the very day Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, they also pass the Declaratory Act, which asserts Parliament's authority to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The constitutional divide between Britain and America remains unresolved. Parliament claims it can do whatever it wants, while colonists insist they deserve the same rights as any English subject. These views are miles apart and can't be reconciled. The Declaratory Act doesn't get much attention amid the Stamp Act repeal celebrations, but Samuel Adams and other radical leaders understand its serious implications. Britain may have retreated for now, but the bigger fight is just beginning. The seeds of rebellion, planted in the frustrations of 1763, are starting to grow. The road to revolution, tea, blood, and resolve as patriots rejoice over the repeal of the Stamp Act. Chancellor Charles Townshend is already scheming his next move in Westminster's game of chess. His Declaratory Act of 1766 set the stage, and now he's eager to test how committed the colonies are to their constitutional beliefs. The Townshend Acts of 1767 go after the very essentials of daily life: glass for windows, paint for protection, paper for communication, lead for construction, and of course, tea for comfort. All these items are now hit with taxes that turn basic needs into symbols of London's control. Unlike the Stamp Act, which colonists could simply ignore, these new taxes are tied to things every household relies on. What makes things worse is that Townshend plans to use the money from these taxes to pay the salaries of governors and judges in the colonies. For years, local assemblies controlled how much these officials got paid through their power over budgets. Townshend's plan flips that balance on its head, making these officials answerable only to Westminster. Now, governors can brush aside what the assemblies want, and judges can enforce unpopular laws without worrying about losing their paychecks. The reaction is quick but selective. Merchants in port cities kick off the first organized economic resistance against these taxed goods, appealing to both patriotism and constitutional principles. The idea of non-importation turns economic necessity into a badge of honor, giving families a way to join the fight for their rights. This economic push spreads through the networks already established during the stamp crisis. Women play a vital role in this movement, with groups like the Daughters of Liberty organizing spinning circles that turn cloth production into a show of patriotism. Drawing rooms, once just places for socializing, now buzz with activity as hostesses serve local herbal teas instead of the imported stuff. These domestic shifts give local manufacturers a new sense of respect and market presence. But in Boston, financial pressures aren't enough to calm the rising tempers. Friction between locals and customs officers escalates into near warfare. Revenue officers, armed with broad search powers, invade warehouses and homes. In June 1768, John Hancock's sloop Liberty gets seized over smuggling suspicions, sparking riots that force ministry officers to flee to Castle William in the harbor. In response, Governor Francis Bernard asks for military reinforcements. By October 1768, red-coated soldiers flood into Boston, turning a constitutional dispute into a military occupation. Soldiers compete for scarce jobs, driving down local wages and stirring up anger among working men. Every encounter between soldiers and civilians has the potential to ignite further conflict. Samuel Adams knows that turning martyrs into symbols can be more powerful than just arguing. Through his committees of correspondence and newspaper essays, he carefully documents every instance of military misconduct, painting a picture of systematic oppression. The breaking point arrives on a cold March evening in 1770, sparked by a seemingly minor incident. A British sentry outside the custom house strikes a young apprentice who insults him. A crowd gathers, and more soldiers show up. Tension rises as civilians hurl snowballs and insults. Then someone shouts fire, and muskets go off into the crowd. That night, 5 Americans fall on King Street. Samuel Adams quickly dubs the incident the Boston Massacre, a name that will resonate throughout American history. The aftermath is just as crucial as the event itself. Captain Thomas Preston and his soldiers find themselves on trial for murder, defended by John Adams, who believes that fair trials show America's commitment to the legal process. Adams's successful defense sets an important precedent. Americans can separate their dislike for imperial policies from their respect for English legal traditions. But Samuel Adams is determined to make sure the political lessons from King Street reach far beyond Boston's courts. His account of the massacre, paired with Paul Revere's powerful engraving, spreads across the continent. The image shows disciplined soldiers firing into defenseless civilians, which contradicts much of the trial testimony, but it perfectly serves Adams's propaganda goals. Slowly, the Townshend crisis starts to ease. London lawmakers, rattled by American economic pressure, repeal most of the duties in April 1770. Only the tax on tea sticks around, kept as a symbol of Westminster's authority. Many Americans see this partial repeal as a win, but Samuel Adams and other radical organizers know the core constitutional issues are still unresolved. That tea tax, no matter how small, still represents the principle of taxation without representation. The next showdown has to be different, more focused, and tougher for moderate Americans to ignore. The chance arises from an unexpected source. The East India Company is nearly bankrupt, the crown jewel of London's commercial empire. By 1773, the company is drowning in debt, with 17 million pounds of unsold tea sitting in London warehouses. Lord North's ministry comes up with a slick solution, the Tea Act of 1773. This act gives the East India Company the right to sell directly in American ports, cutting out the middlemen who usually distribute tea. Now, the company can sell directly to consumers at prices lower than any competitor, including smuggled Dutch tea. While this measure is meant to help everyone, it wipes out the livelihoods of merchants who have built their businesses on tea imports. This commercial threat brings together groups that have been split over constitutional issues. Merchants who previously opposed boycotts now face the risk of losing their profitable businesses. Even moderate Americans can't ignore legislation that threatens their economic survival. More alarmingly, this law sets a precedent for imperial monopolies that could extend to any branch of American commerce. The response kicks off in Philadelphia, where residents band together to stop ships from entering the port. New York follows suit, and Charleston allows the ships to land but stops sales. Boston's situation is trickier because Governor Thomas Hutchinson refuses to let the ships leave the harbor without paying duties. 3 tea ships, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver remain anchored throughout December 1773. Samuel Adams, with the flair of a master playwright, orchestrates the crisis. Mass meetings at Old South Church draw thousands, creating unprecedented displays of unity. By December 16, 1773, the final deadline arrives without a compromise. When news comes that the governor is still refusing, Adams utters the words that sparked the most famous act of civil disobedience in American history. This meeting can do nothing more to save the country. Within moments, men dressed as Mohawk Indians surge from the church toward Griffin's Wharf, dumping 342 chests of East India Company tea into Boston Harbor. The Boston Tea Party marks a new form of protest that carefully balances respect for property rights with a rejection of unconstitutional policies. The imperial response goes beyond what even Samuel Adams imagined. Lord North's ministry decides to make an example out of Massachusetts. The Coercive Acts of 1774, quickly labeled the intolerable acts by American propagandists, specifically target Boston but have a ripple effect on all the colonies. The Boston Port Act shuts down the harbor, cutting off all commerce. The Massachusetts Government Act takes away the province's charter, putting appointments under royal control and heavily limiting town meetings. The Administration of Justice Act lets royal officials accused of serious crimes be tried in England, essentially giving them a free pass. And while the Quebec Act isn't part of the Coercive Acts, it expands Quebec's boundaries down to the Ohio River and establishes French civil law along with Roman Catholic privileges. But guess what? The Coercive Acts backfire in a big way. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, they rally Americans who were previously divided around the idea that if imperial authority can target one province, it threatens everyone's rights. If Westminster can yank Massachusetts' charter, what's stopping them from doing the same to Virginia? These measures turn a local squabble over tea sales into a full-blown continental crisis. The response is organized through the same networks that had already mobilized during the stamp crisis. But now there's a fresh urgency in the air. The First Continental Congress gathers in Philadelphia in September 1774, uniting delegates from 12 provinces. For 7 weeks, 56 of America's most seasoned political leaders debate whether these constitutional disagreements can be worked out within the existing imperial framework or if they need a complete overhaul. The Congress strikes a balance between the radical push for immediate action and the moderate desire for reconciliation. They establish the Continental Association, which lays out a comprehensive plan for non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption agreements. More importantly, they assert American rights in a Declaration of Rights that goes beyond specific complaints and taps into broader principles of governance. These claims aren't just based on English legal traditions, but also on natural law principles that apply to all societies. As winter rolls into 1774 to 1775, both sides gear up for confrontations that seem all but inevitable. In London, Lord North's ministry reinforces General Gage's garrison in Boston, while plotting military expeditions to seize colonial military supplies. Meanwhile, American committees are busy organizing militia training and stockpiling ammunition. The powder alarms of late 1774 and early 1775 serve as practice runs for the larger conflict ahead. The final alarm sounds on the night of April 18, 1775, when General Gage orders Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith to march with 700 men to Concord, where colonial leaders have set up a major military supply depot. Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Dr. Samuel Prescott ride out to warn everyone, and by dawn on April 19th, church bells and alarm guns wake militia companies all over eastern Massachusetts. At Lexington Green, as the sun rises on a spring morning, Captain John Parker lines up his 70 militia against Smith's advance guard. Neither side wants to kick off a revolution, but both realize that the constitutional crisis has reached a point where talking isn't enough anymore. "Stand your ground," Parker tells his men. "Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." The shot that follows, fired by someone unknown, echoes not just across Lexington Green, but around a world that will never be the same again. The age of revolution has officially begun. Revolution ignites. War without a country as the sun rises over Lexington Green. The grim scene reveals 8 locals dead and 10 wounded. Major John Pitcairn's advance guard quickly reforms, while Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith's column continues its march toward Concord, feeling confident that their display of power has reasserted Westminster's authority. But here's the twist. Riders are already racing toward nearby towns with news that will rally scattered militia groups into something that looks like an army. Dr. Samuel Prescott arrives in Concord ahead of the British troops, giving the Patriots a chance to scatter most of the military supplies. When Smith's main force starts searching homes, they find nothing but disappointment. At North Bridge, Captain Walter Lowry's detachment burns a few gun carriages, sending up plumes of smoke. From the nearby hills, the Concord militia sees the smoke and fears their town is ablaze. Major John Buttrick leads 400 Minutemen down the slope toward the bridge. Tension rises as nervous soldiers fire warning shots, and when 2 Patriots are wounded, they retaliate, taking down 3 redcoats. Lowry's detachment retreats in chaos. Smith begins his return march at noon, completely unaware that alarm riders have spent the last 6 hours rallying the Massachusetts countryside. What started as a supply raid has turned into a running battle stretching over 18 miles. Concealed marksmen take aim at Smith's flanks and rear from stone walls and farmhouses. Officers fall to the precise shots of hunters who have honed their skills over a lifetime. Lord Hugh Percy's relief force from Boston stumbles upon Smith's battered survivors near Lexington, leaving them bloodied and demoralized. The retreat continues under relentless harassment. By evening, Westminster forces have suffered around 300 casualties compared to fewer than 100 Patriot losses. The news from Lexington and Concord shifts the constitutional crisis into a full-blown military emergency. In Philadelphia, delegates of the Second Continental Congress, rushing toward their scheduled May assembly, suddenly find themselves tasked with coordinating a war before they even have the legal authority to govern anything. Virginia's House of Burgesses votes to raise militia regiments, while Connecticut Patriots, led by Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen, seize Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. Allen's bold demand that the sleeping commander surrender in the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress shows that these insurgent leaders are starting to think beyond provincial lines. Meanwhile, in Boston, 15,000 New England militia surround General Thomas Gage's garrison, kicking off the siege of Boston. What begins as a spontaneous protest gradually evolves into a systematic military investment that traps 4,000 Westminster troops in the city. On May 10th, the Second Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia, where delegates from 12 provinces confront questions that challenge their understanding of the relationship between the colonies and the mother country. How can they support Massachusetts while still being loyal to the Crown? On June 15th, Congress resolves these tensions by appointing George Washington as General and Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the United Colonies. His Virginia roots ensure that Northern resistance can't be brushed off as mere regional fanaticism. Washington takes command with his usual humility, turning down a salary beyond his expenses. Before Washington could even set foot in Massachusetts, the siege kicks off with the war's first big battle. General William Howe, who just arrived to back Gage's troops, figures that the Patriot fortifications on Charlestown Peninsula have to go. So, on June 17th, he lays out a plan for a direct attack on the entrenchments at Breed's Hill, which, by the way, colonial maps call Bunker Hill. Colonel William Prescott is in charge of about 1,500 Patriot defenders, mostly farmers and artisans from Massachusetts, who have never faced off against professional soldiers in a real battle. Prescott tells his troops, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," a smart tactic to save ammo and boost accuracy. Howe's first charge sends the red-coated soldiers marching up the hill in neat rows. When they get within 60 yards, the Patriot muskets fire off controlled volleys that completely shatter Westminster's front lines. The second charge doesn't go any better for Howe. It's only on the third attack that they finally make some headway. But that's only because the Patriots run out of ammo. The Patriots are left to fight back with clubbed muskets and stones as the Redcoats finally reach their defenses. Prescott then orders a retreat, and Howe's weary forces take over the empty fortifications, but not without paying a heavy price, over 1,000 casualties. The Battle of Bunker Hill proves that regular farmers can stand their ground against one of the world's most professional armies. When Washington arrives in Cambridge 2 weeks after the battle, he finds an army that's more of a dream than a reality. He sets out to shape this ragtag group into a real continental army. Daily drills start turning civilian militias into disciplined units, and standardized gear creates a sense of unity among them. While Washington is busy organizing, Congress is caught up in a heated debate over whether to reconcile or break away. The Olive Branch Petition, drafted by John Dickinson and approved in July, is a last-ditch effort to restore peace. But King George's response crushes any hope for a peaceful resolution. His proclamation of rebellion, issued in August, declares the colonies to be an open and avowed rebellion. Even more concerning, the British government starts recruiting German mercenaries, known as Hessians, which shows that London sees this conflict as a foreign war, not just a domestic issue. As news of Hessian recruitment spreads across the mainland by autumn, public sentiment hardens. Congress responds with Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January 1776. Paine writes in straightforward language that connects with everyone, not just the educated elite. He breaks down complex constitutional ideas so that farmers, artisans, and laborers can grasp them easily. Society in every state is a blessing. Government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil, he argues, taking aim not just at specific policies, but at the whole idea of hereditary monarchy. Common Sense sells a staggering 120,000 copies in just 3 months, shifting the political conversation from dry constitutional debates to fundamental questions about human rights. By spring 1776, military actions have outpaced political discussions. Washington's forces have pushed Westminster troops out of Boston, and both sides have poured in resources and shed blood, making peaceful reconciliation seem nearly impossible. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee introduces a resolution in Congress that finally tackles the core issue, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. Thomas Jefferson, chosen to draft the formal declaration, pulls from philosophical ideas that date back to John Locke. His opening lines lay down universal truths, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Congress gives the thumbs up to the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. And just like that, the United States of America is born. With just a few powerful words, 13 separate rebellions unite into one national revolution. You can hear church bells ringing all over Philadelphia as delegates sign their names, turning themselves into traitors to the crown, but heroes for the new nation. The U.S. exists in spirit and law, but now it has to prove it can survive in a world where nations rise and fall based on their strength. The American Revolution is officially underway. Darkest days, survival and sacrifice. Independence declared in the summer heat of Philadelphia means little to Washington soldiers, who are shivering in New York's autumn winds. While Congress debates constitutional theories, the Patriot Army faces a harsh reality. General William Howe has landed on Staten Island with a whopping 32,000 troops. In contrast, Washington can muster around 20,000 men, most of whom have minimal training and equipment. Howe's strategy is straightforward yet powerful. Controlling New York Harbor would cut New England off from the other states and set the stage for operations throughout the Hudson Valley. The Battle of Long Island on August 27th hits Washington hard. Howe's flanking maneuver catches the Continental defenders off guard, and the rebel soldiers quickly learn that drilling and real combat are two very different beasts. The army that confidently proclaimed independence in July limps back to Manhattan in August, bloodied and demoralized. Worse than the military defeat, Long Island shows just how fragile popular support for revolutionary government can be. Howe's steady advance on Manhattan through September and October highlights a professional military skill that the amateur opposition simply can't match. The surrender of Fort Washington in November epitomizes the disaster, as nearly 3,000 rebel soldiers are captured, leaving Washington with barely enough men to form an army. The retreat across New Jersey turns into a race against time as the Patriot Army crumbles due to desertion, expiring enlistments, and sheer exhaustion. Thomas Paine, marching alongside the retreating troops, captures the pain in his pamphlet, The American Crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. By December, as Washington crosses into Pennsylvania, he commands fewer than 3,000 effective troops. With enlistments set to expire at year's end, his force is at risk of dwindling even further. Just 6 months after declaring independence, the United States is teetering on the brink of military collapse. Yet, adversity also reveals unexpected strength. Local communities step up to organize relief for the rebel soldiers. Women take on responsibilities once reserved for men, managing farms and businesses while their husbands are off fighting. African Americans face tough choices, with some joining the Patriot Army in hopes of gaining liberty, while others side with the Westminster forces after being promised freedom. Meanwhile, Native American tribes generally back the Westminster forces, believing that London's imperial authority offers better protection against frontier expansion. News of Trenton reaches the States during this dark time in the war. Washington's daring Christmas night crossing of the Delaware River in a blizzard, followed by a surprise attack on Hessian forces, shows that American troops still have their fighting spirit. This small victory brings a huge psychological boost for a cause that desperately needs proof that triumph is still within reach. The follow-up victory at Princeton just a week later confirms that Trenton was no fluke. Winter quarters at Morristown give American troops their first real break, but hardships continue to test their revolutionary spirit. Rebel soldiers struggle with inadequate clothing, food, and shelter, while serving a government that has little money and even less credit. Henry Knox's incredible winter journey from Fort Ticonderoga, dragging 59 cannons 300 miles through snow and ice, showcases a level of logistical innovation that European armies rarely attempt. Meanwhile, British strategy starts to shift. Howe realizes that military victories alone can't restore imperial authority over a hostile population. Interest in American independence grows in France as Benjamin Franklin kicks off his diplomatic mission in Paris. While a formal alliance is still months away, secret aid begins to flow to the Patriot forces. By spring 1777, the American Revolution hangs by a thread. The United States exists in name, but not yet in reality, defended by an army that shows more courage than capability. Yet something fundamental has shifted in the American mindset. Ordinary folks have discovered they can band together for effective resistance. Local communities have learned to govern themselves without outside help. Most importantly, Americans have started to envision political possibilities that go beyond the old ways. Turning the tide, Saratoga and the world stage. As Washington's ragtag army settles into winter quarters at Valley Forge, 300 miles north, things are about to shift this local revolt into a global showdown. General John Burgoyne marches south from Canada with 7,000 redcoats, Hessians, and native allies. His plan? To split New England from the other states. He grabs Fort Ticonderoga in July 1777, but that victory quickly turns into a burden. Chasing the American forces takes up precious time, and news of the loss spreads fast through New England's alarm network, getting farmers fired up to join the fight. Burgoyne's march into the interior reveals a major flaw in London's plan, trying to use European logistics in the North American wilderness. His massive baggage train becomes a drag on roads that have to be carved out of the forest, while local militias harass his foraging parties. Meanwhile, Colonel Barré's wing stalls at Fort Stanwix, and Benedict Arnold, a master of psychological warfare, spreads rumors of thousands of reinforcements lurking in the woods, causing the native allies to scatter. The whole expedition falls apart. South of the Hudson, Howe makes a critical mistake by sailing for Philadelphia instead of heading north to back up Burgoyne. Unaware he's been left to fend for himself, Burgoyne keeps pushing forward. His attempt to grab supplies at Bennington runs smack into John Stark's New Hampshire troops, resulting in nearly 1,000 British soldiers lost. In August, command of the Northern Army shifts from General Philip Schuyler to Horatio Gates, and thousands of short-term militia rush to join the fight. At Freeman's Farm on September 19th, Burgoyne's troops claim the field but suffer heavy losses. Arnold's daring moves and Daniel Morgan's riflemen prove that American troops can hold their own against seasoned veterans. The big showdown comes at Bemis Heights on October 7th. Gates wants to play it safe, but Arnold, riding like a whirlwind even after being relieved of command, leads a fierce counterattack. Just 10 days later, near Saratoga, the beleaguered British general surrenders his entire force. News of the victory races to Paris. Benjamin Franklin, dressed in plain Quaker gray, doesn't need to embellish things. The win speaks for itself. On February 6, 1778, France signs the Treaty of Alliance, and suddenly the conflict expands to the Korean Gibraltar and India. Over in Europe, Catherine the Great champions the League of Armed Neutrality, hindering British efforts to control the seas. The tide has turned, but challenges remain. British troops still hold key ports, and American unity is fragile. Saratoga was a pivotal moment. The door to victory is ajar, but it's not fully open yet. Independence now depends on international alliances and a citizen army forged by hardship. The Southern strategy: fire and betrayal. In the winter of 1778, Clinton's War Council in New York wrestled with the new reality that Saratoga had made impossible to ignore. Northern drives had bled veteran regiments white, while gaining little more than proof that New England farmers would fight whenever their liberties were threatened. With France now formally aligned with the rebellion, the struggle had leapt from a colonial insurrection to a global confrontation. Yet surrender was unthinkable. Out of these grim calculations emerged the Southern strategy. British intelligence insisted that loyalty to the Crown ran stronger below the Potomac, and that wealthy planters in Georgia and South Carolina would prefer reconciliation with the Crown to dependence on Massachusetts radicals. Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell's expedition proved at first that this optimism wasn't entirely baseless. On Christmas 1778, he stormed Savannah, and Georgia's patriot government collapsed in a matter of days. The fall of Savannah looked like the first link in a chain that would choke the rebellion into submission. Yet those early successes carried a hidden curse. Formal victory on the coast did nothing to quell the backcountry, where resistance vanished into pine barrens and swamps. Patriot detachments melted into the landscape they knew by heart, returning to strike wagon trains and patrols before dissolving again into the canebrakes. Charleston became the ultimate test of the strategy. In early 1780, Sir Henry Clinton sailed south with more than 8,000 regulars, determined to seize the richest port in the South and break the Patriot War effort in a single stroke. The siege was textbook, and on May 12th, Charleston capitulated, the largest surrender of American arms in the war. Inside the triumph, however, lurked a poison seed. Restoring royal order meant relying on local loyalists, who were often more eager for vengeance than for reconciliation. Banastre Tarleton's green-jacketed legion galloped across the Carolina Low Country, but his refusal to accept surrender at Waxhaw turned bloody Tarleton into the devil of patriot nightmares. If Tarleton was terror, Francis Marion was invisibility. The wiry South Carolinian, soon christened the Swamp Fox, struck convoys and liberated prisoners before disappearing into the dark water labyrinth of the PD. Desperate to smash this hydra of local resistance, Clinton empowered Charles Cornwallis with sweeping authority. Yet he confronted a foe that refused to stay put. To knit chaos into strategy, the Americans turned to Major General Nathanael Greene, a Rhode Island Quaker whose calm masked iron endurance. Greene split his army, sending Daniel Morgan westward to menace Tory strongholds. The chase ended at Cowpens on January 17, 1781, when Morgan engineered a tactical masterpiece. London lost 900 seasoned soldiers, while the American casualty list barely topped 70. Humiliated but unbowed, Cornwallis burned his baggage to move faster, vowing to corner Greene. The two armies danced a brutal waltz called the Race to the Dan. Greene's men, ragged and shoeless, slipped across icy rivers hours ahead of their pursuers. When Greene finally offered battle at Guilford Courthouse on March 15th, Cornwallis believed he'd found the decisive clash he craved. Tactically, he was right. The field belonged to the king's army. Strategically, he had purchased that ground with a quarter of his strength. Greene, though beaten, had survival in hand. Meanwhile, Virginia reeled from new blows. Benedict Arnold, freshly minted British brigadier after his treason at West Point, ravaged the James River. Arnold's raid, though minor militarily, struck at patriot morale, proving that the Revolution could birth traitors of the highest rank. His presence in Virginia drew the Marquis de Lafayette into a cat-and-mouse campaign. By July, Cornwallis had orders to secure a deep-water base on the Chesapeake. He chose Yorktown, fortifying its sandy bluffs with redoubts and earthworks. What he could not know was that two independent Franco-American plans were converging on him. Washington and Rochambeau had calculated a bold stroke: march the Allied army from New York to Virginia, and if the French fleet could win temporary control of the Chesapeake, trap Cornwallis on his peninsula. In September, Admiral de Grasse's cannon thundered at the Battle of the Capes, driving a British relief squadron back to New York and sealing Yorktown by sea. A fortnight later, Washington's and Rochambeau's columns linked with Lafayette. Trapping Cornwallis behind ramparts he suddenly realized were prison walls. On October 19, 1781, the Earl surrendered more than 7,000 troops. British drummers reportedly beat a march called "The World Turned Upside Down" as the ranks stacked muskets. Yorktown did not end the war at a stroke, but it broke the Southern strategy beyond repair. The king's dice had rolled, rattled, and come up short. Now the United States stood on the shoreline of victory, bruised yet unbowed. Victory at Yorktown. A world turned upside down. As Cornwallis settles his army into Yorktown, feeling pretty confident that this tobacco port is the secure base he's been searching for, forces he doesn't even know about are on the move. Over in Newport, Rhode Island, Rochambeau's French army is gearing up for a march that's about to mix European military skill with the determination of the Continental forces. Meanwhile, off the Virginia Capes, Admiral de Grasse's fleet is sailing north from the Caribbean, bringing much-needed reinforcements. Washington's headquarters is buzzing with excitement as he and his team plan a campaign that could finally lead to a decisive victory. Reports from the Marquis de Lafayette confirmed that Cornwallis is sticking to his position in Yorktown, even though it's becoming clear that French naval support could cut him off. Rochambeau's march from Rhode Island shows just how organized the French military is. Citizens in Philadelphia line the streets to watch as the Allied armies parade through the capital, the very place where independence was declared 5 years ago. It's a powerful symbol. America's citizen soldiers have earned respect as equals from some of the world's best military forces. When de Grasse arrives in the Chesapeake in late August, it changes the game completely by establishing French naval dominance. Admiral Thomas Graves's fleet from New York tries to regain control of the seas during the September 5th Battle of the Virginia Capes, but the French prove to be the better tacticians. Graves has no choice but to retreat back to New York, leaving Cornwallis to face the music. Siege preparations kick off right away, with Allied engineers setting up investment lines to systematically chip away at Yorktown's defenses. Alexander Hamilton leads one of the assault columns that captures British redoubts during a night attack on October 14th, breaking through Cornwallis's outer defenses. The artillery bombardment ramps up, making Yorktown streets unlivable. In a desperate move, Cornwallis tries to break out across the York River on the night of October 16th, but a violent storm scatters his boats. When dawn breaks on October 17th, it's clear he's in deep trouble. A lone drummer boy appears on the ramparts, beating a call for parley, while a white flag signals Cornwallis's willingness to discuss surrender. On October 19, 1781, the Allied armies line up for a ceremony that will mark the end of Westminster's major forces south of New York. The British musicians reportedly play "The World Turned Upside Down" as 7,000 redcoats and Hessians march between American and French lines to lay down their arms. News of Cornwallis's surrender reaches London in late November, hitting just as Lord North's ministry faces growing political pressure. The Prime Minister reportedly receives the news as he would have taken a ball in his breast, realizing that this military defeat spells political disaster. "Oh God, it is all over," North exclaims. Parliamentary debates throughout the winter of 1781 to 1782 reveal the empire's weariness. Peace talks start informally, with John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay representing American interests in Paris. By November 30th, 1782, preliminary peace articles are signed, giving American commissioners most of what they wanted. The definitive Treaty of Paris, wrapped up on September 3rd, 1783, officially ends the global war that started as a colonial rebellion. Washington's farewell to his officers at Francis Tavern in New York embodies the Republican ideals that fueled Patriot resistance. The commander who could have taken the throne instead chooses to hand power back to civilian leaders. On December 23, 1783, he resigns his commission before Congress, a moment that leaves European observers in shock as they can't fathom military leaders willingly giving up power. As the American Revolution wraps up not just with military victory, but with the quiet miracle of a constitutional government, a new challenge lies ahead. The military revolution has come to an end, but the political revolution is just beginning. The constitutional revolution, a new beginning. After 8 years of revolutionary warfare, peace finally settled over the 13 states, but everything had changed. Independence was just the start of a much bigger challenge, building a government that truly reflected the ideals for which so many Americans had fought and died. The Articles of Confederation, thrown together in the heat of war, turned out to be totally inadequate for handling the peacetime issues that popped up. Congress found itself powerless, unable to regulate trade, gather enough money, or enforce its decisions. It felt more like a league of friendship than a real government, and it was on the verge of breaking apart into 13 separate nations. Things got worse when the new nation faced a financial crisis, struggling under the weight of massive wartime debts. Continental currency became practically worthless, leading people to say it was not worth a continental. States started printing their own money, which just added to the chaos. When Daniel Shays led a group of fellow veterans in an armed uprising against Massachusetts courts that were foreclosing on their farms, political leaders finally realized that liberty without order could easily spiral into anarchy. Meanwhile, foreign powers were testing America's resolve, and it wasn't pretty. Britain wouldn't budge on leaving frontier posts. Spain shut down the Mississippi River to American trade. and European diplomats openly questioned whether the United States could survive long enough to keep its promises. Then, delegates from Virginia and Maryland met at Mount Vernon to sort out river disputes, and they quickly saw that broader constitutional reform was a must for the nation's survival. Their talks led to the Annapolis Convention, which set the stage for Alexander Hamilton's bold call for a constitutional convention. In the summer of 1787, Philadelphia's State House buzzed with energy as delegates gathered, not to declare independence this time, but to create something new. George Washington presided over the proceedings, while James Madison brought detailed plans for a stronger federal government. It didn't take long for the convention to realize that they needed to scrap the Articles altogether and come up with something groundbreaking, a republic that stretched across a continent. The debates were intense. Big states wanted representation based on population, while smaller states fought for equal say. Southern delegates counted enslaved people for representation, which sparked debates about whether property should even have a vote. The Connecticut Compromise found a middle ground with a bicameral legislature, and the Three-Fifths Compromise exposed the moral contradictions that independence hadn't resolved. When it came to ratification, the nation split between Federalists, who backed the Constitution, and Anti-Federalists, who worried that a stronger federal government would threaten the very freedoms they had fought for. The Federalist Papers offered brilliant defenses of the new system, while Anti-Federalists pushed for explicit protections of individual rights, leading to the promise of a Bill of Rights. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington took the presidential oath, marking the shift from revolutionary resistance to constitutional governance. The Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, fulfilled the Federalist promises and showed that the Constitution was a living document, open to improvement. As the French Revolution raged across the Atlantic, Americans realized their own revolution had been surprisingly moderate, achieving change through constitutional means rather than the chaos that had engulfed their former allies. By 1825, as the revolutionary generation began to fade, the United States had checked off most of the goals that independence aimed to achieve. The constitutional system had passed its early tests and showed an incredible ability for peaceful change. But challenges still loomed. Westward expansion, which fulfilled revolutionary dreams, pushed Native American tribes aside, and the institution of slavery, which directly contradicted the principles of the Revolution, spread westward, creating tensions that the Constitution might struggle to resolve peacefully. The real victory of the Revolution became clear, not just in breaking free from tyranny, but in creating institutions that would ensure human liberty for generations to come. The American Revolution might have wrapped up, but its work carries on through a constitutional government that provides peaceful ways to extend freedom's benefits while keeping the union that independence made possible. And so, our journey into the past comes to a quiet close. If you're still awake with me, I hope this tale brought you a little peace. If you enjoyed our time together, a gentle like lets me know. And subscribing means you'll never miss the next calm adventure. If you know someone who might need a little comfort tonight, feel free to share this story with them. Thank you, truly, for being here. Until next time, I wish you the sweetest dreams.